that moment when you can see it's working. You're not hoping anymore. You know, everything has fallen into place, it's coming. And right then, for no reason you can point to, with no external cause, no argument that could be explained to anyone, something inside you starts working against you. Not once, every time, in the same place. Someone else would call it bad luck. You know luck has nothing to do with it, because you're the one pulling the lever. And as long as you call it coincidence, it will keep happening. The price isn't what you failed to achieve. The price is what you knew you were capable of, and what you extinguished yourself. But that's not the real point. There's a distinction that almost no one names. Between failure and sabotage, failure has a shape. It has a moment. It has a cause you can point to. You tried. It didn't work. There's even a kind of integrity in that. Sabotage doesn't look like that. Sabotage doesn't come when you're far from the finish line. It comes when you're close enough that it's no longer abstract. And right then, quietly, without announcement, something in you starts moving in the opposite direction. You don't see it immediately. Nobody does. Others see bad luck, bad timing. They see a man who tried and will try again a little later when the conditions align, and you don't correct them because you use the same words yourself. But somewhere beneath those words, you know you were there, 10 meters from the finish line, and that something in you turned around. Orson Welles was 25 when he made Citizen Kane, a film that many still consider the greatest ever made. That wasn't beginner's luck. It was the precision of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. And then came decade after decade of projects that were filmed, edited, abandoned. The Other Side of the Wind, Don Quixote, The Deep. None of them finished in his lifetime. Not for lack of money, though that was always the excuse. Not for lack of talent, of which he had more than any one life could spend. But as though completion wasn't a safe place. As though everything that came after Cain had to bear the weight of comparison to Cain. And as though part of him knew he didn't want to risk that comparison. It wasn't laziness, it was architecture. Something in him older than any decision that measured, weighed, and always found a reason why the time wasn't quite right yet. And this is where the problem with the word sabotage begins. Because sabotage sounds intentional, and what you do doesn't feel that way. It feels like thinking, like caution, like responsibility to the idea, to the project, to yourself. You think it's slowing something down from the outside, but it's actually accelerating something from the inside. The mechanism is perfect precisely because it doesn't present itself as a mechanism. It presents itself as judgment, as a measured, balanced analysis of the situation. And while you analyze, the window closes, the moment passes, and you're left standing at meter 9 convinced you were being rational. But that's not the end of the mechanism. That's only its beginning. Imagine there's a threshold, not metaphorically, a real threshold. The kind you cross when you walk into a room where something important is being decided. The job you wanted, the conversation you'd been putting off, the project you'd been carrying for years. Far from the threshold, you're calm. You can talk about what you're planning, how you'll do it. You're confident. One step from the threshold, something shifts. No panic, no moment you could describe to anyone else. Just a quiet change in internal atmospheric pressure. And then the questions begin. Not new questions, the same old questions, only louder. Is this the right moment? Is this good enough? What if it isn't? And while the questions grow, your body already knows the answer you'll give. This isn't perfectionism. Perfectionism wants a better result. What gets activated here doesn't want a better result. It wants a delay, because delay keeps the possibility alive. Because as long as you haven't moved, you can still be the person who could. The moment you move, it becomes real, and real things can fail. The psychologist Neal Miller studied at Yale in the 1940s what exactly happens when a person approaches a goal they simultaneously want and fear. He discovered something counterintuitive. The closer you get to the goal, the faster fear grows. Not slower than desire, faster. The alarm doesn't quiet as you approach, it gets louder. Here lies a paradox that few people name clearly. The closer you are to success, the more intense the fear. Because at a distance, the price of failure is abstract. It has no face, no form. But 10 meters from the finish line, it suddenly has all of that. It has a date. It has people who know you tried. It has a version of you that was that close. And that version you can't afford to lose. Maybe you call it realism in yourself, or responsibility, but 10 meters from the finish line, that isn't realism. That's an alarm going off because you're too close to what you actually want. Because wanting means being vulnerable. And being vulnerable means something can hurt. And while that alarm runs, and it runs precisely, consistently, without fail, you construct arguments that sound like wisdom but are actually a wall. A wall between you and the moment in which you would have to be visible, truly visible, not as someone who's planning, as someone who has arrived. This didn't start with you, it started much earlier, in a room where you learned what happens when you want something too much. In a moment when you understood, not in words, but in your body, that emotional needs come at a price, that wanting is dangerous, that what you love can be lost precisely because you wanted it too much. This isn't trauma in the dramatic sense. Often it's quiet, every day. The praise that didn't come when it was needed, a parent who was present but distant. Love that was conditional, not cruelly, just conditional. You received it when you were invisible, you lost it when you were real. And something in you remembered that. In astrology, there's a pattern that maps precisely this dynamic with remarkable precision. Saturn's intense aspect to the moon isn't a defect in the chart, it's architecture. A description of an internal system that learned emotional needs are a luxury you can't afford to show too openly. Saturn is the principle of structure, limitation, and cost. The moon is the principle of need, feeling, and vulnerability. When they're in tension, every time the moon wants something real, Saturn immediately asks, "But what if you don't get it? What if you expose yourself and it's not enough?" And the moon retreats, long enough for the moment to pass. Marlon Brando was perhaps the greatest actor of the 20th century, a man whose presence on screen redefined what acting could even be. But throughout his life, at the moment he could have received an award, status, admiration, love, something in him would close. He refused the Oscar. He walked away from projects. He retreated to Tetiaroa, a private atoll in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, further and further from everything he could have had. It wasn't contempt for Hollywood, though he used that narrative too. It was a deeper incapacity. to allow himself to receive what he had craved his whole life. Do you recognize something in that? It doesn't have to be as extreme as Brando's. It could be a compliment deflected with discomfort, a promotion you turned down because you weren't ready yet, a relationship you ended just when it became safe. Every time, the same place. Every time, the same moment. 10 meters from the finish line. And the question Saturn poses to the moon isn't whether you're capable. The question is far more brutal than that. The question is, do you deserve to arrive? You thought this was only about projects, career, ambition, but the mechanism doesn't make that distinction. With equal precision, with equal consistency, it works on people too. You meet someone. In the beginning, it's easy because in the beginning it isn't real. There's still a distance that protects you. And in that distance, you function brilliantly. You're open in ways that surprise even yourself. And then something becomes real. The person stays, they come back, it starts to feel safe. And right in that moment, when it should be easier, it gets harder. You start finding flaws you didn't see before. You become cold at the moments when you should be present. Until the person begins to wonder if it was all an illusion. But it wasn't an illusion, you were real. You just became afraid of that reality. Ingmar Bergman was perhaps the greatest film director of the 20th century, a man who demanded that actors be completely emotionally naked. No protection, no distance. But in his private life, everyone who loved him described the same pattern. He was completely present until a relationship became safe. And the moment safety arrived, he was already somewhere else. A man who spent his whole life making films about the impossibility of closeness lived precisely that impossibility he was filming. Mary Ainsworth demonstrated in the 1970s in a series of clinical experiments that children whose parents were not emotionally available develop one precise survival strategy. They learn not to ask, not because they don't need, but because they learn that asking is costly. That strategy doesn't disappear with age. It remains inscribed deep beneath the surface, far beyond the childhood in which it was learned. And here lies the core of this pattern in relationships. You're not afraid of loss. You're afraid of staying, because staying, real staying, in a relationship that works, with a person who sees you, means being completely visible, without the distance that protects you. And Saturn immediately asks the moon, what if they see you and decide it's not enough, and you're already retreating? Better to stay at meter 9 than to arrive and discover you're a stranger there. There's a kind of loss that has no date, no moment you can point to, just one morning you wake up and something that once seemed possible no longer seems that way. Not because anyone said no, but because you changed, quietly, precisely, without witnesses. Every time you stopped 10 meters from the finish line, you wrote one sentence about yourself. Again, I didn't go. And that sentence didn't erase itself. It accumulated, stacking one on top of another until it became something heavier than thought. Always in the same place, always 10 meters from the finish line. It became a belief, and the belief became an identity. Because identity doesn't follow experience. Identity precedes it. You stop being someone who hasn't succeeded yet. You become someone who doesn't finish. And that difference between not yet and never isn't semantic, it's existential. And here we arrive at the question this mechanism never poses out loud but always implies. Who would you be if you hadn't stopped? Not who would be more successful or wealthy, but who would you be? What would your voice sound like in a room? What would your relationship with risk look like, with closeness, with possibility? Because every time you pulled back, you didn't just lose the result, you lost a little of that version of yourself that believed it could arrive. And that version grows quieter, less accessible in the moments when you need it most. And one day, when you truly need it, you find you can barely hear it. Not because it left you, but because you stopped listening. There's no cure for this, no technique, no sentence you'll read here that will change the architecture that took years to build. Saturn and the moon don't get erased. That voice that measures, that asks, that puts a price on every desire. It's not a temporary guest, it's part of you. It was there from the beginning, it will be there until the end. And that isn't bad news. It's the only news with which something real can be done. Because there's a precise difference between a man who sabotages unconsciously and a man who sees the mechanism as it activates. Between a man whom the alarm stops and a man who hears the alarm, recognizes it, and consciously chooses to take a step. The fear doesn't disappear, the step gets taken anyway. This isn't courage in the cinematic sense. It isn't a dramatic gesture. It's in the moment when the alarm activates, when the questions begin, to stop, to not let it make decisions for you, just to see it, to call it by name. Because a mechanism that has a name is no longer a mechanism, it becomes a choice, and in the moment you name it correctly, this is an alarm that activates because I'm close to what I actually want. It loses some of its power, not all of it, some, and that some is enough. Seneca was one of the most powerful men in Rome, a philosopher and advisor to Emperor Nero, a man who wrote about the passage of time with a precision that still cuts today. In his work on the shortness of life, he wrote something that wasn't intended as motivation, but as an indictment. Most people don't live. They wait for life to begin, not waiting for favorable conditions, waiting for fear to become small enough to ignore. And that, says Seneca, never comes. The race isn't your enemy, neither is the finish line. The enemy is the belief that who you are changes when you get there. You won't become someone else when you arrive. You'll be the same person, same Saturn, same moon, same architecture, just on the other side of the line. And that line won't resolve any of what your inner structure carries. But it will prove something that right now is only theory, that you can, not once ideally when everything aligns. Now, with these cards, in this moment, 10 meters from the finish line, with the alarm ringing, with questions that have no answers, with uncertainty that will never be smaller than it is today. There is no perfect moment for the final 10 meters. There is only a step